Good afternoon and welcome everyone. You are attending today our webinar entitled Extreme Water Levels on the Upper Great Lakes, What Can Be Done? I am Mary Muter. I am Vice Chair of Restore Our Water International. This webinar is being presented by Restore Our Water International, or ROWI, in conjunction with the Georgian Bay Great Lakes Foundation, or GBGLF. ROWI is a US-Canadian nonprofit binational umbrella organization of several shoreline property owners associations, small business owners, and concerned citizens. GBGLF is a group of shore property associations dealing with environmental issues around Georgian Bay. Before we start with the formal presentation, I would like to inform you that you can submit questions to us during this briefing through the questions pane on the right side of your screen during the webinar. To open this pane, please go to the GoToWebinar sidebar and scroll down to questions. You may want to undock the pane to be able to type in a question that may be a bit longer. We will try to respond to all of your questions at the end of the presentation. I would also like to point out that these slides from today's presentations will be posted and will be available for you to download. We will send out an email to everyone with a link to that. At this time, I would like to introduce Roger Gauthier, the current chair of Restore Our Water International. Roger lives on the southern shore of the Straits of Mackinac between Lakes Michigan and Huron. He has been involved for over 45 years in Great Lakes hydrology, hydraulics, and environmental protection programs with the U.S. National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and the Bilateral Great Lakes Commission. Roger?
Good afternoon, folks. I want to make sure that you have a little bit of insight as to what we're going to be discussing this afternoon. And if I get the next slide up, our webinar is focused on providing you with a historical perspective on how lake levels are managed, what the driving forces are behind the current high water crisis, how high and how long they could stay high, what management options are available for reducing lake levels, including their limitations and institutional constraints, and what degree of impact these options could have. I also want to revisit the subtitle of this presentation, that being what can be done. In many respects, I'd like to rephrase that to what should be done. I will be providing you details on how 4 management options currently not in use that can be considered to lower lake levels on all the Great Lakes, including cutting back on inflows from the Long Lochagochie diversion into Lake Superior, increasing the outflows from the Lake Michigan diversion at Chicago, managing ice conditions in the St. Clair and Detroit rivers, and releasing more water from Lake Erie through the Black Rock Canal. These options are referred to as high water crisis response measures. I want to emphasize early that there is no magic bullet to eliminate record high water levels. The crisis measures that we will talk about today will only provide modest relief in the order of a few inches. These are minor temporary fixes. Regardless, I can't stress strong enough that every inch of drop in levels is critical and can provide millions of dollars of damage reduction. I will showcase one major permanent fix that would have long-term benefit to reducing the incidences of erosion and flooding throughout the Great Lakes. I also want to tell you up front that I will be expressing numbers only in imperial units, not in metric. Please indulge me on this issue if you would. Our discussion today is focused on the upper Great Lakes, those being Lake Superior, Michigan, Huron, St. Clair, and Erie. The upper Great Lakes are separated from Lake Ontario by the 325-foot drop in the Niagara River, mostly over the Niagara Falls. The International Joint Commission, or IJC, has conducted 2 webinars over the last 2 months on severe water levels on Lake Ontario, so I don't intend to address current Lake Ontario management issues in this webinar. Please note that the IJC is conducting a webinar tomorrow at noon on the water level crisis on all the Great Lakes. If you want to participate in this webinar, please visit the IJC's webpage for their webinar announcement. I would also like to note at this time that Lakes Michigan and Huron are considered as one lake, as they are connected by the wide and deep Straits of Mackinac. Water levels on the upper Great Lakes are affected by natural factors and human modifications to the system. Natural factors include inflows from snowmelt runoff, rainfall in the drainage basins and lake surfaces, evaporation from the lake, and evapotranspiration from vegetation. This slide showcases some of the important human interventions to the water balance of the system, including outflow regulation from Lake Superior and Ontario, inflows from the Long Loch and Ogoki diversion into Lake Superior on the top of the slide, outflows through the Lake Michigan diversion at Chicago on the lower left, and inter-lake transfers between Lakes Erie and Ontario, including the Welland Canal and the New York State Barge Canal. The Great Lakes St. Lawrence system is managed in accordance with the legal framework outlined on this slide. The International Joint Commission, or IJC, was created as a direct function of the Boundary Waters Treaty of 1909. This treaty codified domestic water use, hydropower production, and commercial navigation as the premier uses of the waters of the Great Lakes. Shore property impacts, recreational uses, and environmental protection were not factors in the early years of the 20th century and have been consistently disadvantaged ever since. After the Boundary Waters Treaty was put in effect, the IJC issued its 1914 Orders of Approval for regulation of Lake Superior, which permanently modified the ranges of water levels on that lake. In 1952, the IJC issued its Orders of Approval for the regulation of Lake Ontario outflows, which permanently compressed water levels on that lake by 50%. Both Orders of Approval have been modified since their inception to address regulation plan improvement for each lake. The 1950 Niagara River Treaty and earlier diplomatic letters between the US and Canada institutionalized the distribution of waters in the Niagara River for hydropower production between nations, and the permanent diversion of Albany River watershed inflows into Lake Superior through the Long Loch and Ogoki diversion. A series of US Supreme Court decisions formalized the current management strategy for diverting water from Lake Michigan into the Des Plaines and Illinois rivers and beyond into the Mississippi. In addition, there have been a series of investigations conducted under the auspices of the IJC over the last 50 years on how to improve water quantity management in the Great Lakes St. Lawrence system. Unfortunately, several important recommendations from these prior studies have not been implemented. I will highlight some of these failures, particularly from the 93 levels reference study and the 2013 Upper Great Lakes study, and show how they have affected the current crisis. One of the biggest man-made alterations to the Great Lakes St. Lawrence system was introduced by the IJC's 1914 Orders of Approval for Lake Superior, permanently eliminating the lower 1 foot of the natural range of Lake Superior. Lake Superior's natural 4 3/4 foot range was reduced to a bit more than 3 3/4 feet due to this action, effectively raising the mean elevation of the lake by 6 inches. This action was taken to promote hydropower production in the St. Mary's River and to ensure higher water for commercial navigation. The change in the natural range, however, and unfortunately, has eliminated the storage capacity of Lake Superior as the headwater lake to absorb periodic extreme high water supplies to the Great Lakes. The incidence of flooding along Lake Superior would have been radically reduced if this alteration never occurred. Restoration of Lake Superior's natural range was briefly considered at the end of the 93 IJC levels reference study and was shown to provide significant benefit downstream. The trade-off would reduce hydropower production in the St. Mary's and would require channel dredging and harbor redevelopment around Lake Superior. Unfortunately, a comprehensive economic evaluation was never completed to assess the benefits of restoring the natural range of levels for Lake Superior. Further investigations were ignored by the IJC's 2012 Upper Great Lakes study, though this option was formally requested to be investigated by the Great Lakes Commission, representing the 8 Great Lakes states and the 2 Canadian provinces. This would be a major and permanent transformation of the hydraulic regime of the Great Lakes if that natural range was restored. Considering the looming climate change challenge, restoration of Lake Superior's natural range would reduce flooding and erosion throughout the Great Lakes. We need to have a comprehensive and objective evaluation of this measure, and all users of the Great Lakes need to share equally in the benefits and costs. This table includes data published by the IJC in prior studies outlining the cumulative and permanent changes to the water levels throughout the Great Lakes St. Lawrence River system caused by diversions into and out of the lakes, consumptive uses of its waters by industries and municipalities, and channel modifications. The single biggest change is channel changes in the St. Clair River that permanently lowered Lakes Michigan and Huron by as much as 20 inches. I'll be discussing how the St. Clair and Detroit River impact water levels upstream and downstream. Unfortunately, these rivers are not monitored by any oversight body of the IJC. This shortfall needs to be addressed. I'd like to highlight 3 of these activities of importance. The first being the permanent raising of all lakes by the implementation of the Long Loch and Agoki diversion into Lake Superior, with its greatest impact being a 4.5-inch increase in elevations on Lakes Michigan and Huron and lesser amounts on the other lakes. The second cumulative impact that I want to flag is the lowering of all the lakes by the Lake Michigan diversion at Chicago, which caused a permanent lowering of Lakes Michigan and Huron by 2.5 inches and lesser amounts on the other lakes. The third cumulative impact of consideration is the constriction of the Niagara River mouth at the outlet from Lake Erie between Buffalo, New York, and Fort Erie, Ontario. I'll be coming back to each of these 3 man-made changes in greater detail later in this webinar. The current water level forecast just made this week for Lakes Michigan, Lake Superior, and Michigan and Huron for the next 6 months are shown on this slide. These forecasts are made by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and coordinated with Environment and Climate Change Canada. The forecasts indicate that we should expect a 7-inch rise on Lake Superior before it peaks in August, staying 2 to 3 inches below the record highs established last year. The Michigan Huron forecast indicate that these lakes will rise at least another 5 inches before the lakes peak in late July or early August, setting new record highs each month. This rise is not as severe as the forecast that was made in April. Lakes Michigan and Huron is currently 10 inches higher today than this time last year. I need to clarify that these forecasts are for mean monthly water levels. Barometric pressure changes, winds, and waves can change water levels anywhere along the coastline in the matter of several feet or on a daily or even hourly basis. Please note, while you're looking at this slide, that Lake Superior's modified water level range of 3 3/4 feet is compared to Lake Michigan's 6.5 feet natural range, which is rapidly increasing to more than 7 feet. The loss of storage capacity on the upstream Lake Superior caused by the IJC's 1914 orders of approval has been a major factor in the increased incidence of high water levels on every other Great Lake. The current forecast for Lakes St. Clair and Erie are shown on this slide. These forecasts indicate that Lake St. Clair will rise another 1 to 2 inches before it peaks in July, now staying below its all-time record highs set last year by about 2 to 3 inches through October. This is a welcome news reflecting less inflows from Lake Huron. Lake St. Clair is currently 2 inches higher today than this time last year. Lake Erie's forecast indicates that this lake will peak this month and start falling through October, likely staying around 4 inches less than the all-time record highs established last year. Lake Erie is currently 3 inches higher today than last year. The IJC has deviated from Lake Ontario Regulation Plan 2014 by discharging large quantities of water into the Quebec section of the St. Lawrence River. Lake Ontario is currently 18 inches below its record high for May, and is projected to rise another 3 inches before it starts to recede through October. The lake should stay at least 12 to 18 inches below its record high for the rest of 2020. Please note that Lake Ontario outflow controls are much more effective than any other man-made controls elsewhere in the system. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers also produces a 12-month outlook on water levels for all the Great Lakes. As you can see on this slide, water levels next winter and the following spring on all the upper Great Lakes could set new record highs if we receive higher than average rainfall rates and snowfall. On the other hand, if we see significant drought conditions through this spring and summer and a mild fall and winter, Lake Superior could drop back to its long-term mean. Unfortunately, even if we incurred severe drought conditions for the next 12 months, Lakes Michigan, Huron, St. Clair, and Erie will likely stay well above their long-term means. The global climate has changed appreciably over the last 50 years. Its impact in the Great Lakes certainly have been seen over the last 2 decades. The most obvious impact has been to establish new extremes on most of the lakes. Lake Superior and Michigan Huron set both new record lows and new record highs in the last 2 decades. New record highs have been set on each of the other lakes. The duration of extreme periods also has been unprecedented. The warmer planet has caused significantly and measurable increases in storm intensities and corresponding rainfall amounts. Over the last 20 years, climate change has caused measurable decreases in ice cover and snowpack accumulation, particularly north of the 45th latitude through the center of Lakes Michigan and Huron. All of these changes impact the net basin supplies, or NBS, to a lake basin, and therefore whether water levels will rise or fall. In addition, the methods for computing the net basin supplies has been changed by federal agencies over the last few years, complicating analyses. Rapidly changing water levels are having major impacts in the coastal zone of the Great Lakes. Wetlands have been radically affected with profound changes in extent and in species composition. Invasive plants including Phragmites, purple loosestrife, Eurasian milfoil have exploded in the nearshore environment during severe low water levels, while native macrophytes have been destroyed during extreme high periods. These changes have a significant impact on fishery health and population. Mary Muir will address fishery impacts later in the webinar during the question and answer period. This graph created by Hansen et al. Combines all temperature observations across the globe for both land masses and water bodies from 1880 through 2010. Although global temperatures fluctuate over long periods of time, it is clear that starting around 1970, the mean global temperature of the planet has risen by at least 0.5 degrees centigrade. More sophisticated satellite observations from 2010 through today show that this trend line is continuing, with new average global temperatures setting records every year or so. We should expect greater climate variability to impact Great Lakes water levels, pushing us into conditions never recorded in the past. This graph, produced by NOAA's Great Lakes Environmental Research Lab, showcases how both Lake Superior and Michigan Huron switch from below average water levels to near record highs. The red dots show the water level rise in comparison to the last 100 years of record. For this 2-year period, from January 2014 through December 2015, the net basin supplies for Lake Superior were unprecedented, while the net basin supplies for Lake Michigan and Huron were only exceeded about 5% of the time in the past. This switch caused Lake Michigan and Huron to rise over 4.5 feet in that 2-year period. Another way to look at climate impacts on the lakes is to use the crisis action levels defined in the IJC's 1993 levels reference study report for both extreme highs and extreme lows. This color-coded table for Lakes Michigan and Huron identifies those years in red when more than 6 months of the given year were below the low crisis action level, and in blue when more than 6 months of the year were above the high crisis action level. Record-setting years are shown in bold. Please note that years of extremes for Lakes Michigan and Huron may not coincide with the other lakes. As you can see, Lakes Michigan and Huron has seen severe lows during several periods before the 14-year period from 2000 to 2013. This recent low period was twice as long as the Dust Bowl era of the 1940s that hit the continental U.S. Extreme high water periods occurred in numerous decades before the current crisis period. Lakes Michigan and Huron will likely set new record highs through the rest of 2020. Other complicating factors. It's important to know that other factors have affected the current water level conditions. The first additional noteworthy factor may not have a major impact on coastal damages downstream of Lake Superior, but it is nevertheless troubling. Over last winter, the IJC authorized its International Lake Superior Board of Control to deviate from Plan 2012 prescribed flows by discharging more water from Lake Superior into the St. Mary's River for at least 4 months. I'll discuss this factor in detail in a few slides. The more compelling factor here is number 2. It's not as well known, that being the changes that have occurred in the St. Clair River, the outlet for Lakes Michigan and Huron. The St. Clair River from the Blue Water Bridge to its delta is not stable. Its geometry has changed appreciably over the last 120 years through natural geomorphic changes and man-made alterations. I'll elaborate more on this issue soon. Going to the first issue, this slide shows the Lake Superior outflows being controlled by structures shown on this aerial photo between Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan, and Ontario. Generally, 95% of the Lake Superior outflow is controlled by hydropower plants on either side of the St. Mary's River. The average outflow over the last 102 years is 76,000 cubic feet per second, or CFS. This month, the target outflow is 80,900 CFS, a 6.5% increase above the long-term average. For most winter periods, the gate settings on the 16-gate compensating works, which is in the middle left-hand side of this photo, is fixed, since ice buildup makes changes dangerous if not impossible. Outflows are determined by Plan 2012, which is designed to balance the water levels between Lake Superior and Michigan and Huron to avoid extremes on either lake. Over a 4-month period last winter, the International Lake Superior Board of Control requested and received approval from the IJC to deviate from Plan 2012's prescribed outflows from the lake. The rationale that I received was that these deviations were necessary to ensure that hydropower received 100% of their allocation during the winter period when operating conditions are more severe and ice formation can impede flow through the turbines. This practice may be a standard approach each winter, but it negates the functionality of the regulation plan to balance water levels between Lakes Superior and Michigan and Huron. The cumulative 4-month deviation has caused Lakes Michigan and Huron to rise by 1¼ inches. This is not much, but it still can be calculated. To date, there is no plan by the IJC or its Superior Board to pay back this discretionary action. At the same time these deviations were being improved, the lake level forecasts were showing that Lakes Michigan and Huron would be at least 14 inches higher in this spring than the previous year. Simply, this action on the part of the IJC indicates a preference for Lake Superior interest in hydropower demands without adequate regard to downstream impacts. Channel modifications on the Detroit-St. Clair River system are one of the most significant human modifications to the water balance of the Great Lakes. The 2013 IJC Upper Great Lakes study confirmed that historic sand mining, navigation channel dredging, and subsequent riverbed erosion has increased the conveyance of the river and permanently lowered water levels upstream. The study concluded that some form of adaptive structures should be investigated to compensate for past channel modifications, particularly to address crisis low conditions if they occur in the future. Unfortunately, nothing has been done since the 2013 report was completed to assess the benefits, cost, and impacts from this option. The 2013 study concluded that it was critical to monitor the changes in the river's geometry and to implement a continuous current measuring station upstream of the Blue Water Bridge, which is right on the top of both of these two photographs. Conveyance changes in the St. Clair River have been evaluated through 2012, but have not been reported on since. Periodic mapping of the river bathymetry has been collected by the Army Corps of Engineers, but not analyzed and reported on. Additionally, recent analysis of data from the continuous current measuring site upstream of the Blue Water Bridge indicates that its data may not be accurate for assessing Lake Huron outflows. This slide shows a comparison of satellite imagery from 2014 on the left to 2019 on the right. It showcases significant changes in sediment transport from Lake Huron into the St. Clair River. With rising water levels, more beach erosion and bluff retreat has increased the sand supply into Lake Huron that is picked up by nearshore currents. It is quite probable that sand may be settling out or shoaling in the St. Clair River, decreasing the river's cross-sectional area and hence its ability to discharge water from Lake Huron or its conveyance. There is a clear need to assess the changes in the St. Clair River's geometry. More funding needs to be provided to the Army Corps of Engineers to analyze the recent bathymetric survey data and to develop comprehensive conveyance modeling for the river and to report on changes on every 5 years. Further work needs to be conducted by the Corps and the U.S. Geological Survey to assess the accuracy of the flow metering data from that site upstream of the Blue Water Bridge. This slide showcases the conundrum that is likely occurring with the conveyance of the St. Clair River. It shows the monthly mean water levels on Lake Superior on the top, Michigan Huron in the middle, and Erie on the bottom from 2014 through today. I have highlighted the fall and winter seasonal water level declines in each lake over this 6-year period. Each lake over the 100-year plus history of water level observations goes through a typical 1-foot annual rise from winter lows to summer highs and a corresponding decline from summer peaks to winter lows, or a typical 2-foot seasonal cycle. Lake Superior's fall and winter seasonal decline has been largely typical and has been the case for Lake Erie. Lakes Michigan and Huron seasonal declines over the 6-year period, however, have been atypical. The principal reason given by the IJC is that Michigan and Huron has incurred above average net basin supplies over the last 6 years. However, recent investigations indicate that the net basin supplies may actually be less than average for this lake over the same period. There's only two possible explanations to this conundrum. The first being that the method to compute the net basin supplies that was recently changed is unreliable, or second, the inflows from into Lake Michigan and Huron from Lake Superior are higher than normal, or the outflows into the St. Clair River are lower than normal, or that both conditions are occurring simultaneously. This raises serious questions about whether the St. Clair River conveyance has changed in the recent past. The St. Clair and Detroit River system is the only major river course in the Great Lakes system without a formal international oversight body, and hence changes in this part of the Great Lakes have been sorely overlooked by the IJC. We're calling for the IJC to rectify this shortcoming by creating an international working committee with membership, including riparian interests, to continuously monitor the changes in the critical part of the Great Lakes system. Now let's get to the meat of the issue. The IJC advised the governments of the US and Canada that work needed to be done to implement a series of crisis response measures in the 1993 Levels Reference Study. These crisis response measures included actions to react to extreme highs and lows by establishing alert levels and action triggers when these measures should be implemented. The crisis measures include actions that can be started at no cost, being referred to as non-capital cost measures, and those that would require funding, or capital cost measures, or some combination thereof. Our federal governments recognize the importance of this strategy and directed the IJC to follow up on its recommendations. Unfortunately, no progress has been made on this front over the last 28 years. On the next few slides, we will examine what these crisis measures are. The low water crisis response measures outlined in the report included increasing the inflows into Lake Superior from the Long Loch and Agokie diversion if possible. This option has never been adequately assessed. Whenever possible, increase the outflows from Lake Superior into Lakes Michigan and Huron whenever Superior could provide significant relief to the downstream lakes. Install the compensation measures in the St. Clair River, such as innovative and adaptable underwater devices that could hold water back on Lakes Michigan and Huron. These devices could compensate for the increased river conveyance caused in the past by the past dredging and mining operations and bed erosion. These devices must be able to be deactivated during high water supply periods to eliminate any impact upstream. Finally, an option was identified to restrict outflows from Lake Erie at the mouth of the Niagara River. Steps for implementation of these low water measures need to be defined and problems resolved so that they are in place before we are exposed to extreme low water conditions all over again. For extremely high water levels on the upper Great Lakes like today, the recommended crisis measures included decreasing the inflows to Lake Superior from the Long Loch and Agokie diversion, increasing the outflows to the Lake Michigan diversion at Chicago, and in addition, the recommendations included installing ice booms at the head of the St. Clair River to reduce ice jams that limit the outflows from the lakes for up to 4 months of each year. In addition, the high water crisis response measures include opening the Black Rock Lock and the Niagara River to discharge more water from Lake Erie. Implementation of these measures requires immediate coordination between the US and Canadian federal governments that unfortunately has not begun. Some of these measures can be implemented almost immediately, but others may take several years to be put in place. I'll elaborate on each of these options on the next 4 slides. The Long Loch Agokie diversions were initiated in 1943 after an agreement was completed between the US and Canada to increase the hydropower production in the Niagara River during World War II. The agreement was completed via diplomatic letters between nations that were confirmed in the 1950 Niagara Treaty. The agreement called for an additional 5,000 cubic feet per second to be added to the Canadian share of waters to be used for hydropower production in the Niagara River. There were no provisions in the diplomatic letters nor in the treaty as to when the Longlachagokie diversion would expire, nor whether cutbacks could occur when Great Lakes water levels were extremely high. For the last 77 years, the average Longlachagokie diversion inflow into Superior has been 5,200 CFS. The natural inflow from Longlacha and Lake Nipigon watersheds before the diversion was about 1,400 CFS. The authority to discharge the 200 CFS difference between the average Longlachagokie inflows and the 5,000 CFS maximum allocation for the Niagara River has never been identified. Over the last 77 years, the Longlachagokie diversion has ranged on a monthly basis from 1,250 to 17,700 CFS. The Longlachagokie diversions were reduced in the late 1970s, the mid-1980s, and mid-1990s as a reaction to public pressure exerted during prior high water periods. These prior cutbacks are useful precedences for demanding cutbacks today. If the diversions were cut back to their natural levels in 2015, when the action triggers for high water were exceeded on Lake Superior and later on Michigan and Huron, the lakes would be significantly lower than they are today. Michigan and Huron would be 4.5 inches lower today if that measure was put into place. This Chicago diversion was implemented in the 1880s as a response to a typhoid epidemic in the Chicago urban environment. The diversion is a complicated system of direct diversions into the Chicago Sanitary and Ship Canal and the Calumet-Sag Canal. It includes effluent discharges from municipalities and from stormwater runoff directly into the canals. The Chicago diversion has been a long-standing legal battle between the city of Chicago, state of Wisconsin, that was finally settled by the U.S. Supreme Court Special Master. The operation of the Chicago diversion is conducted in accordance with a Supreme Court directive in 1978, limiting the diversion to 3,200 CFS with some minor annual variations. Studies conducted in the 1970s indicate that the waterways could handle a doubling of that diversion flow, although this would require significant leadership at the highest levels of the U.S. federal government. The biggest complication to implementing this option is the operations of the Asian carp barrier downstream in the Des Plaines River, which may not work at higher flows. One factor that needs to be considered during extreme high water periods is the impact of ice buildup in the St. Clair and Detroit rivers, which can completely shut down outflows from Lake Huron on occasion. Even without a complete ice jam, the ice buildup in the river retards the outflow from Lake Huron. This situation does not occur in the Niagara River, as the hydropower utilities have been deploying an ice boom at the head of the river for the last 50 years to stabilize the ice on the eastern end of Lake Erie. During the current high water period on the upper Great Lakes, the ice conditions on the St. Clair and Detroit River can be stabilized by simply shutting down commercial freighter movement through the corridor and directing the U.S. and Canadian Coast Guards to conduct ice-breaking operations only when ice jams occur. The impact of this measure on levels needs yet to be calculated. Another high water crisis response measure is to open the Black Rock Lock at the end of the Black Rock Canal in the Niagara River to discharge water whenever it is not being used to lock commercial or pleasure boat traffic. This option was utilized during the high water period in the late 80s. The impact of this measure on levels also needs to be computed. This slide summarizes how easy or how difficult it would be to implement each of those 4 high water crisis response measures, along with the response time and the water level impacts on each of the lakes, if they were fully implemented starting today. The easiest and most effective measure to implement is cutting back Longlachagokie, as no capital costs would be needed water level reductions would be felt within a few months on Lake Superior and on Ontario, dropping these lakes by 2.5 inches and 3 inches respectively. Water level reductions on Michigan and Huron, St. Clair, and Erie could take a year or two to be fully manifested, but this option would reduce those lakes by 4.5, 3.5, and 3.5 inches respectively. Water level reductions on Lakes Michigan and Huron and St. Clair could be realized by effective ice management in the St. Clair River on a yearly basis, whenever severe winter conditions occurred. Lake Erie and its upstream lakes could see modest water level reductions relatively quickly if more waters pass through the Black Rock Lock, although some capital costs may be incurred with this measure to address lock maintenance issues. Finally, implementing the increase in the Chicago diversion outflows will require a considerable amount of further investigation and substantial U.S. federal leadership, all of which is unlikely in the immediate future. The water level impacts of these measures have been computed by application of an Excel-based routing model generated and updated by William Bayakowski, a registered Canadian professional engineer who is a technical expert with both ROI and GBGLF. You may conclude that implementation of these high water crisis response measures will only provide a minimum benefit to the region this year. But please remember, every inch counts. And with every inch of reduction, we will avoid millions, if not billions of dollars of losses. What can you do to help? If you want to join in the effort to pressure governments to act to lower high water levels on the upper Great Lakes, we would like to suggest that you consider the following options. First, support ROI's effort by joining our loose-knit community as a member organization or forming your own neighborhood organization to participate. ROI does not require dues, but exists on contributions from supporting organizations and individuals whenever necessary to cover our lobbying and outreach efforts. The directors of ROI are all voluntary. We have no paid staff. Second, and of immediate need, we would ask you to send a letter, email, or call your U.S. representative on the Great Lakes congressional delegation or to your Canadian Parliament representative to demand immediate action on the part of both governments to lower water levels now. You can find sample messages on the ROI Facebook page or on the Georgian Bay Great Lakes Foundation webpage. We'll also be emailing you a sample copy of language to use for these letters. We'd also appreciate any contributions that you could send to us via our social media sites or through the mail to the addresses included on the last slide of this presentation. In summary, I would like to reinforce 4 points for this audience. First, climate variability over the next 5 to 10 years could push the upper lakes to new record levels, both high and low. It is certain that the current water levels crisis will cause massive economic, ecological, and social problems, and some actions need to be implemented immediately to minimize damages. Remember, every inch counts. Second, a longer view is necessary to help make the Great Lakes more climate resilient. Historic modifications to the systems can be reversed, likely with substantial and acceptable costs to prevent future water level extremes. Unfortunately, the current mindset is to react to one crisis after the next, otherwise referred to as crisis management mindset. Prudent long-term planning and follow-through are needed. Third, we should be sending a clear message to the International Joint Commission to think and act outside the box. We don't need more studies. We don't need ineffective adaptive management approaches or excuses. We need them to follow through on published recommendations. Furthermore, we need an equal emphasis on the St. Clair Detroit River system to monitor the critical changes in this waterway. Finally, I hope that these webinars will help us to attain a unified message to demand action on the part of our governments. It is now time for us to answer some of your questions. If you have a question, please provide it to us through the questions pane on this webinar. We will try to answer all your questions if time permits. If we run out of time, we will post our answers to your questions on our social media pages, and we will email you a response accordingly. Also, please be aware that all the slides and videos used in today's webinar will be accessible through the Georgian Bay Great Lakes Foundation webpage, which is on the next slide. Thank you for your time and attention.
So this is Mary Muter back again, and we are going to try and answer some of your questions. I just want to say to start out, though, that we have received many questions by email with people very concerned about what they could do to protect their shoreline during these extreme high crisis level conditions. And I would like to point out to everyone that we have posted on our website, on GBGLF's website, that's at the bottom of this slide, 2 documents that are very helpful in providing guidance to shoreline property owners in terms of what they can do to their shoreline property to protect erosion and damage from these extreme high water levels. But I can tell you the stories that we're hearing and seeing are very, very concerning. And as Roger has said, the damages are going beyond millions. If you assess that collectively for all of Michigan, Huron, and Georgian Bay, I think it's well up into the billions by now. So Roger, have you got anything else you want to add on that topic? Because we've had a lot of questions regarding that.
Okay, fire away. That's
okay.
Let me just say that those 2 reports that she's referring to are published reports from the Wisconsin Sea Grant Network. They're incredibly good visuals, and they really help anybody who's thinking about doing some engineering work to put in coastal shore protection.
Right. Okay, I'm going to have you answer this question, Roger. Why has Lake Superior been so favored by previous policies?
This is, I can only give you my personal reaction based on 40 years of being engaged in water quantity management issues. Hydropower and commercial navigation have been given high credence. The change in the Lake Superior water level range was done expressly to benefit those 2 interests. We have seen continuation of that activity. Meanwhile, in that last 140 or 150 years, the shorelines along the Great Lakes have been rapidly developed. I know that on the U.S. side, we have over 300,000 parcels on Superior, Michigan, and Huron, St. Clair, and Erie. We are now clearly the bigger hitter from the riparian interest than hydropower or commercial navigation. Lake Superior has had some precedence. We need equity throughout the system.
Okay. So the next question is, since insurance claims are high based on water damage, is it possible to have the insurance companies assist with our demands for action?
I would believe so. In particular, if there is a significant outcry and claims coming forward from on the U.S. side through the flood insurance program, that flooding has been a major issue. The difficulty in the States, and I'll let you answer that from the Canadian perspective in a second. In the States, erosion damages are not covered ostensibly by insurance claims. We do need some level of federal engagement on providing relief to shore property owners who lose property values and structures from erosion, which is definitely being driven by these extreme highs. Mary, do you have a response to the Canadian side of this question?
We also have areas where people may not be able to get insurance, and if you can't get insurance, then you will not be able to submit a claim under these conditions. Also, insurance companies have been very reluctant to insure properties on islands, and we have 30,000 islands on Georgian Bay. So unless historically you've had insurance, in some cases you cannot get insurance now. So it's definitely a big concern for shoreline property owners. But I think I would add to that the concern about the loss of value of shoreline property owners. And I think municipalities should be paying attention to this because our properties are all going to be revalued. And this in turn will lower the taxes that local municipalities will be able to recover. And they have additional expenses during these high water level conditions. So it's going to be hard on everyone. So I'm going to move on. There's someone who's asking for us to restate the projections for this summer. I know Roger did that, but can you quickly re-summarize that?
I want to make sure I've got that absolutely correct. So bear with me as I go through my notes.
So while you're looking that up, then I'll answer another question. Can you explain again why there was an increase in sand supply at the St. Clair River? We are aware that with the high water levels, it's causing erosion and movement of sand along with the current from property that's on the south side of Lake Huron, particularly on the Canadian side. The beaches along there are eroding with the high water levels. That sand supply is moving into the St. Clair River. And we are concerned that the areas that scoured out during low water levels may now be filling in with that sand supply. And we don't have recent bathymetry to be able to assess what that change is and what the impact would be. So Roger, did you find the projections for this summer?
Yes. For Lake Superior, expect a 7-inch rise from today, with it peaking in August. It will be 2 to 3 inches below its record highs that were established last year throughout that period. Michigan and Huron will be at least 5 inches higher by the time it peaks in late July or early August. It will be setting new record highs each month. It is now 10 inches higher than it was last year. On Lake St. Clair will rise another 1 to 2 inches before it peaks in July. It will be staying below its high record set last year through October by a few inches. Lake Erie forecast indicates that it will peak this month and start falling through October. It'll stay about 4 inches below the all-time record highs that were established last year. I do want to comment at this stage of the game that these are May forecasts that came out this week. They are substantially lower than they were in April. So it's indicating that we are seeing a reduction in the net basin supplies in the early part of this spring. So if we keep our fingers crossed and Mother Nature continues to have a very mild spring throughout the Great Lakes region with very low rainfall rates, we may see the water levels coming down on every one of the lakes as a consequence.
Correct. So someone's asking, say they can't find the ROWE website for the draft letters. ROWE only has a Facebook page. The letters will be posted on Georgian Bay Great Lakes Foundation.com website. They're not there now, but the letters will be there very soon, along with names and contact information about both state, provincial, and federal elected officials. So, and we will send them out by email to everyone who has participated in these webinars. So, we've got 2 questions from Flo. Is there data combined modeling system of precipitation flows, levels, and weather forecasted data to assist in both emergency and midterm, long-term actions? That data is, we were able to obtain the components data to determine net basin supply. We now have that data, but there is also data for this posted on GLEROS, the Great Lakes Environmental Research Laboratory website. Also, US Geological Survey have some relevant data posted there. What is the approximate inflow to Lake Superior past to Lake Michigan and Huron, and how is the existing reduction in water level? That question, it must be how is it affecting the existing reduction in water levels? Roger, can you try to answer that?
I think both of those are extremely complicated questions, and my best answer on the fly on here is that over the last 20 years or 25 years, there's been an absolutely huge increase in data collection, coordination, and modeling. There is a US-Canadian interagency coordinating body that does not report directly to the IJC, but it involves all the federal agencies that are collecting data. They do coordinate that. They do coordinate the net basin supplies and the components for the net basin supplies. A significant amount of that work, I give credit to NOAA's Great Lakes Environmental Research Lab when they developed the advanced high resolution prediction models. The information from that modeling package is not as readily available today as it should be. So there's a lot of really good information to be moving ahead on. The problem with the water balance of the Great Lakes is that the conveyance of the St. Clair River is estimated, and it's been estimated to the best of the ability, predominantly by the Corps of Engineers and Environment and Climate Change Canada, using stage-fall relationships through the river course. And it was supposed to be improved with this acoustic velocity meter upstream from the Blue Water Bridge. But there needs to be a much more concerted role in identifying how that conveyance has been changing since 2012. It is a huge unknown in looking at the water balance. The other question that was dealing with how Lake Superior outflows are impacting the Michigan and Huron water levels. Generally, the regulation plan 2012, is built upon prior plans that balance those lakes between each other. So generally, I will say that if you don't deviate from the plan itself will mitigate damages when we're at extremes, both extreme highs and extreme lows. The unfortunate part of what we're dealing with now is all 5 of the Great Lakes are at or near record highs over the last 18 months. And there's no way that one lake can absorb more flow from another lake.
Okay, thank you, Roger. I just want to say that Jeff Simpson, who's coordinating this webinar for us, has posted under handouts. You'll see that on the right side of your screen. If you click on handouts, he's posted Roger's slides. So you can download them right now and save them as a reference. But we will also be posting them later on our website. So we've received a lot of questions. We're not going to be able to get to all of them, but I want to sort of summarize. There have been several questions asking about septic systems, both on Lake Michigan and on Georgian Bay. Septic tanks and leaching fields that are now underwater, and people are asking what they can do about this. This is a very serious concern. If the tile bed is flooded, there is a possibility that nutrients and bacteria will leach out into nearshore waters. And as the water temperature warms up over the summer, It not only could cause increased algal growth, but if enough bacteria are present in the water, it could also make the water unsafe for recreational use. So we have a lot of concern about that, and we don't have any specific answers for that, other than certainly our organization is hoping this summer to collect water samples so we can assess that. But I would recommend that property owners probably need to get in touch with your local municipalities to find out what, if anything, can be done. The easiest solution, but the local authorities would have to approve it, would be to pump out the underground septic tank and to put in a temporary holding tank that was properly secured and well above the water level. But we are not experts on that, and so we really, that's not an area of expertise that we can comment on. So what are the politics of the issue right now between US and Canada? I think you can tell from this that we are united in our concern about this and what the solutions that could be implemented. But Roger, would you like to elaborate on that?
No, I don't think I want to touch that with a 12-foot pole.
Okay. Okay. Are either governments looking into recreating the natural flood zones, which would help with rising water levels?
I guess my reaction is that there are programs, and I'm going to speak from the U.S. perspective, for at the community level, at the state level, for zoning and construction setbacks. Most environmental entities, the watershed councils throughout the Great Lakes shorelines, are all advocate for some natural vegetative buffer with the lakes themselves. So, you know, those recommendations have a lot of value, that the best protection is natural vegetation. The best protection is the bluffs that do exist. So any new construction, all I would plead for people to do is to build as far away from the shoreline as practical. They can always walk to the shoreline to see it or access it, but building right on top of it is a menu for disaster over the long term.
Okay. We've been getting a fair bit of praise. This one is saying, great presentation, very informative. How do the May projections for Lake Huron compare to the April and March projections? Roger?
Oh, actually, I was saying last week that the lakes, Michigan and Huron, are going to rise 10 inches. Now the number is 5 inches. So right. It's going in the right direction. Maybe next month it's going to come down, but I wouldn't count on it. I think that this is just a vagary in the forecasting.
Right. So someone's asking us to post a link to the papers on shore protection. Those documents are posted on Georgian Bay Great Lakes Foundation's website, and I think they're also posted on Facebook. Is that correct, Roger? On ROWI's Facebook page?
Not yet, but I can easily put them out there. It's a little more difficult to move materials through Facebook than it is through a website.
Through a website. So you're probably best going to Georgian Bay Great Lakes Foundation.com, and you will find them there.
And we can email them to anybody who's asking for them.
Will this webinar be available for replay for my family to watch? We are recording it, and it will be posted again on Georgian Bay Great Lakes Foundation website. And we will be replying to everybody who's on the webinar. We will be sending you an email, and we'll send you a link to that, along with obviously the letter that we're hoping people can send. we're starting to notice shoreline residences in Georgian Bay obtaining large boulders from various onshore sources and dumping them into the lake to protect their property. Is this a good idea? What is the impact to the lake, water quality, any other comments? I think this is in line with what we've already said on this. We suggest that you read these documents that we've posted and you follow the advice in these documents in terms of what to do on your waterfront. We are not experts on that. And whether it would impact water quality, again, it would determine what was there. We really can't comment on that. So I think there are lots of questions saying wonderful and thank you. I think that's about it for now. Oh, here comes another. What happens to our fish in Lake Huron? This is a very good question. We provide support to Professor Pachow Fraser of McMaster University, and they have been doing fisheries, water quality, wetlands assessment on Georgian Bay since 2003. They were able to determine the change in fish community that happened during sustained low water levels. They are now seeing a change now at extreme high water levels, but it is making their work very challenging because the wetlands on Georgian Bay have been pushed up against granite shoreline or into shoreline vegetation, including trees, which does not provide very good habitat for fish. So the fish community is changing, but to really properly assess it, it's not easy. But it's obvious that the very small fish, young fish, but also minnows, they're having trouble getting into that shallow shoreline habitat where there's plants that they can hide in so that they don't get eaten by larger fish. Those small fish are now having to hang out with the large fish. This may have a long-term impact on the fish community, not just in Georgian Bay, but in Lake Huron and in Lake Michigan. Okay, I've got another question. Well, I'm not sure we even want to go there, but can the excess waters be released into the USA to help with areas of drought?
That question comes up regularly. You know, it came up in the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, and now it's back.
Yeah.
You know, it's a simple question with a very complex number of consequences to it. And most noteworthy is back 2010, the Great Lakes Compact was signed by the 8 Great Lakes states, the governors of those 8 Great Lakes states, to manage additional diversions in movement of water outside of the basin. And they are in universal, unanimous agreement to not ever allow that to occur. And I'm fully agreeing with that consideration, predominantly because if you did that during excess periods of time on the lakes, people become dependent on that source, and you know, basically you're going to be precluded from shutting it off when we have less water than necessary to maintain the equilibrium on the lake. So it's not a good idea in the long term, and it's probably not economically feasible to start with.
Yes, I think those are my views too. This was discussed extensively when they were talking about diversions of water into and out of the Great Lakes. And it was then that Canada and the US came to an agreement and signed the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Sustainable Water Use Agreement. So, and that idea was definitely not something that was considered or supported. So, I think that's about it for questions. I just want to say that the Jeff Simpson has said that this webinar will be available for replay and will be posted on our website. So With that, I think we should wrap this up and thank everyone for participating. And you can see our last slide where you can go to get help, more information, posting of these webinars, and how you can donate. If anybody has any further questions, we are more than happy to try and answer them by email later. So you can send us emails, but expect an email back from us too. So with that, I would like to thank everybody for participating today. If you know of anyone else that would be interested, we have one more webinar coming up next Tuesday at 7 p.m. where we will basically be going through this again, but we're hoping that some different players might participate. So please invite anyone you know to participate then. Thanks so much, everyone. Bye for now.
Thanks, everyone.